A Doberman was tied and left to die in the desert. What happened next will shock you. There are afternoons in Red Mesa when no one should step outside, the kind of 113-degree F heat that melts the tar under your feet and burns anything foolish enough to be still breathing out there. Yet, that day I found myself driving down Route 47 under a blade-white sky as if the sun itself had been sharpened, and I was only planning to stop by the old gas station near the desert's edge before heading home. I had no warning, no instinctive pull, nothing at all until I saw it. A thin, black shape, more shadow than body, trembling beside a crooked wooden stake in an ocean of red earth. I hit the brakes so hard the tires screamed across the gravel, and that's when the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a black and tan Doberman with a rope cinched around its neck so tight, dried blood had turned the fur dark. Its tongue was cracked like the desert floor beneath my boots, its eyes sunken with that hollow resignation. Only dogs who know they've been left to die ever carry, and the sight punched the air straight out of my lungs. No decent human being could have done this. Not abandonment execution. The heat alone could kill a dog in under 2 hours, and from the way it sagged, chest-rising in shallow suffocated pulls, I knew it had been here far longer than that, surviving on nothing but pain and whatever stubborn spark refused to let go. I shoved the truck door open and stepped out, my voice firing before my mind caught up. What kind of monster would do this? The Doberman tried to raise its head when it heard me, a small effort, weak as spent breath, yet enough to tighten something sharp in my chest. Its tail pressed flat to the ground, but its head lifted just slightly, as if asking whether I was the last face it would ever see. I knelt beside it, and the scorched smell coming off its burned coat hit me like another heat wave. Its skin was seared dry and splitting. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. I reached for the rope, the heavy industrial kind used for anchoring posts, because whoever tied it wanted more than cruelty. They wanted to guarantee the dog couldn't escape its death. A cold anger rose in me, not the explosive kind, but the slow, knife-sharp kind America's small-town elders know too well. Anger at cowardice, at the kind of people who hurt creatures that cannot fight back. I swear, if I find who did this, I swallowed the rest when the dog whimpered, as if asking me to focus on saving it, instead of cursing the world. As I slid my fingers under the rope, I brushed something metal-thin, cold-old. A tag. I pulled it free from the matted mix of sweat and blood. The engraving froze every muscle in my body. Shadow. I lifted my gaze to meet its eyes, and suddenly the emptiness there wasn't nameless anymore. It wasn't a random stray, not someone's discarded pet, not a backyard dog left behind because responsibility got inconvenient. Shadow was a service dog. A Doberman that had once saved someone's life, a 4-legged soldier, a partner, and now it had been left in the desert to die like trash. The anger inside me tightened, rising past heat and into something breathless. Whoever did this wasn't just cruel. He was what folks in Red Mesa and the older Americans before us reserved for the worst kind of man, a damn coward. Shadow whimpered again, a sound as thin as wind slipping across sand. I placed my hand gently on his head. If you're hearing this, please take 1 second to hit subscribe and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Not for the algorithm, but because I want to know whose hearts these stories reach, and I want you to help carry them further so we can protect more voiceless lives together. It's all right, buddy. I'm here now. I'm not leaving you. Then I lifted him so light he felt like a bundle of bones wrapped in skin and ran for the truck. I had lived in Red Mesa for nearly 20 years, long enough to understand that this desert carried 2 faces, one breathtaking in its beauty, and another so unforgiving it never apologized for taking whatever life wandered too close. And people like to say only those who had lost enough stayed in places like this because only loss could anchor someone here. Maybe they were right, and maybe that was why I was still standing on this stretch of sun-beaten earth after all these years. My name is Ethan Cooper, 55 years old. I used to be a firefighter in Flagstaff, running into collapsing houses and answering calls where the sound of a single voice could tell me I was about to add another ghost to the room I slept in at night, and I survived all of it until the day my wife Laura walked out the door and never came home again. A simple collision, a distracted driver, a brake too slow, 8 seconds. That's all it took, and 8 seconds shredded everything I had ever built. Her absence hollowed out the rest. After that, I left Flagstaff and moved to Red Mesa, a place of wind and red dust and scattered roofs where people carried their grief so quietly you only noticed it in the way they held their breath, and no one here asked questions or pried into wounds that weren't theirs to touch. They let you find your footing again in whatever way you could. It was probably what I needed. I lived in a small house tucked north of town, the tin roof rattling whenever the winds picked up and the old wooden fence creaking as it had listened to every story I never dared say aloud. And mornings here were peaceful, simple, and sometimes so lonely they made your bones shiver. But I had grown used to it, or at least I believed I had. In recent years, I helped Deputy Mark Dalton with a few animal cruelty cases around town because Red Mesa wasn't wealthy, but most folks were decent, though. There were always a few shadows in every corner. Someone dumping a cat in a trash bin. Someone starving a dog behind a backyard fence. And when a case turned uglier than usual, Mark would call me along. He said I had a knack for seeing what others miss, but really, I just knew what it felt like to be left behind. That was all. And that was why I couldn't turn away when I saw Shadow in the desert that day. It wasn't only because it was a dog, or because it had been tortured, but because in the way it looked at me, a mix of despair and some trembling will that refused to die, I saw myself from years ago when the world folded in on me and I had to claw for a reason to stay alive. The desert had a brutal mirror. Red Mesa was a strange town. By day, it felt calm enough to make you think you could heal in its quiet vastness, but by night it reminded you that everyone carried a wound no one else could see, and the people who lived here, veterans miners, long-haul drivers, widows, the elderly with no family left, had all chosen it because everywhere else was too loud for their pain. So had I, and a part of me knew Shadow hadn't crossed my path by accident. When I lifted him from the scorching ground, the thinness of his body pressed into my palms with every fragile breath he took, and his weight too light, the weight of something abandoned and forced to fight alone, sent a shiver through my own memory, because I knew exactly what that kind of survival felt like. I had lived inside it for years, and in that moment I understood something I had never said aloud. I didn't help Mark with cruelty cases because I wanted to be a hero. I did it because I knew there were pains that only needed one person to step forward and say, "I see you. I'm here." No promises, no preaching, just presence. Shadow needed that, and maybe I did too. As I drove toward Red Mesa Animal Clinic, I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, and his eyes were no longer the empty hollows I had seen in the desert, but held something faint and stubborn, something still breathing beneath everything else. Was it hope? A question. A final plea for someone to care. I didn't know, but I knew I wouldn't let him die in silence the way this town once swallowed me and mine. And that was the moment this story truly began. I laid Shadow across the back seat of the truck, his body radiating heat, as something pulled straight out of a collapsed fire line, and the Sonoran desert didn't spare anything. Not a lizard, not a man, and certainly not a Doberman tied down until his strength drained into the sand. When I shut the door, Shadow tried to lift his head, those hollow eyes locking onto me, as if he needed proof I wouldn't vanish the moment he blinked. And I whispered, "I'm not going anywhere, buddy. The truck rumbled off Route 47, tires grinding over red gravel in a rhythm that hammered against the anger boiling in my chest. And each time I checked the rearview mirror, I saw Shadow jolt with every bump, yet fight to keep his eyes open. There was something in that gaze not pleading, but the same stubborn will I had seen in firefighters who crawled out of burning rooms on nothing but instinct. Survival had a look. I reached back and blasted the air conditioning, angling the vents toward him as he panted in harsh, shallow bursts, his chest pressed tight to the seat with breaths so thin I kept leaning over to be sure he hadn't given up. On that stretch toward town, I finally had time to examine what I'd missed when adrenaline had me by the throat, and Shadow's coat smelled scorched patches of fur, gone exposing raw skin and old scars. But it was the rope that caught me. I lifted it, rolling it through my fingers at a stoplight near town, and the thickness told the story before the frayed inner fibers confirmed it. This was industrial-grade rope used for securing heavy equipment, not something anyone used on a dog. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate harm. But why? And why a service canine? The metal tag, half hidden beneath his burned fur, glinted again, and I read it once more. Shadow. Service canine. Service dogs weren't ordinary animals. They were trained partners to veterans officers or people who needed a companion just to move through the world, and dogs like Shadow weren't pets. They were comrades. So why had one been left to die in the desert like discarded trash? As I turned down Red Mesa's main road, that question clung to me like grit on a sweaty collar, and the desert had a way of coughing up its ugliest secrets on the hottest days, but this felt wrong in a way that didn't belong to locals or bad luck. It smelled of something deeper, stranger. Shadow let out a low sound, then not fear, but pain. A soft, broken tremor, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles cracked. The sound dragged something out of memory the day Laura died. I heard that same thin note, the noise a life makes when it's trying to say it isn't ready to be erased. That sound had followed me for years, and now, through Shadow, I heard it again. I leaned toward the mirror and said, "You're not dying, not on my watch." And as we neared Red Mesa Animal Clinic, something unexpected happened. Shadow raised his head, once more frail and trembling, yet driven by a sharp focus I didn't think a collapsing dog could muster, like he needed to be sure I was someone worth trusting. I pulled into the lot and swung open the back door, and the moment I reached for him, Shadow pressed his nose lightly to my hand. Not a lick, not a nuzzle, just a touch. A fragile exchange, but real. I lifted him, his body, limp enough that I feared he would break inside my arms, and stepped through the clinic doors just as Dr. Hannah Pierce glanced up from the front desk. Her expression shifted from calm to alarm in the span of a heartbeat. "Ethan, what?" "Found him in the desert." "Shadow, Service K9, he's fading." And she didn't ask another question because good people don't waste time on explanations when a life is slipping through their hands. Right then, Shadow's head dropped against my shoulder, his breath fluttering like a thread of smoke caught in a crosswind. And that was the moment I knew this. If there was even the smallest chance to rewind whatever horror brought him to that desert stake, it would begin here in the same town that once broke me, now giving me a reason to rise again. The glass doors of Red Mesa Animal Clinic swung open as I rushed inside. Shadow limp in my arms like a child whose life was hanging by a few fraying threads, and the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the icy air from the vents made my skin tighten as if the heat of Route 47 had only been a fever dream. After the desert's brutal furnace, the clinic felt like another world, though not necessarily one strong enough to hold on to him. Dr. Hannah Pierce looked up the moment we entered, and her face shifted into the focused urgency of someone who had dealt with too many emergencies but never learned to accept them. "Put him on the table, Ethan, now." Her voice was clipped decisive, giving no room for fear or hesitation, and when I laid Shadow onto the stainless steel surface, the cold metal striking his burned skin sliced through the air like a blade. He whimpered soft, barely there, yet enough to twist something deep inside me. Hannah pressed her stethoscope to his chest before flicking her eyes toward me with a look that told me the situation was worse than I imagined, and she said, rapid breathing, dangerously high temperature, severe dehydration. We need IV fluids immediately. She signaled for the tech and I stepped back but couldn't peel my gaze off Shadow as his chest fought to rise each breath like a climb up a crumbling hill. "Ethan, the rope," Hannah asked. I handed it to her, and she ran a thumb over the frayed inner fibers before her brow tightened. "This isn't for dogs. This is industrial grade." The truth of that hit me like falling concrete, no mistake, no ignorance. Someone meant for this to happen. Shadow jerked when the IV needle slipped into his leg, and Hannah murmured, "Good boy, stay with us." Just then, the door banged open again, and Deputy Mark Dalton stepped in tall frame, filling the room with the weight of someone familiar with tragedy but never numb to it. I heard a possible cruelty case over the radio. "Is that him?" Mark asked. I nodded. "Found him off Route 47. Tied out there." Rope meant for heavy equipment. Mark's eyes cut toward Shadow, and for a heartbeat his face flashed with a rare simmering fury. "Who in this town could do something like this?" he muttered. I didn't know what to say. Red Mesa was small, and people here carried their secrets like stones in their pockets. But pain made humans unpredictable. Hannah checked Shadow's heartbeat again. Weak, but present. "We need to cool him now." She layered cold gel packs around his neck and belly, and Shadow twitched, breathing harder like he was trapped in a nightmare someone else had locked him inside. I stood closer. "Shadow, stay with me. I'm right here." Mark glanced over. "Shadow." "You naming him?" "It's on his tag," I said. His expression sharpened instantly. "Service K9, I'll contact federal records." Hannah paused for half a second at that. If he's a service dog, where's his handler? And why was he left like this? A heavy silence draped over the room, then the kind that carried darker possibilities neither of us wanted to say aloud because there were only two reasons a Service K9 ended up abandoned. Either the handler was gone or the handler chose to leave him. Both were grim. Hannah resumed working with the rhythm of someone fighting for a life others had already walked away from, and the IV drip began its slow descent pressure grief. Hope, one drop at a time. After a few minutes, Shadow cracked his eyes open. Just a sliver. But it was enough to pull me closer. His gaze met mine, and in it I saw fear, yes, but also something else. A fragment of memory, a sliver of instinct, a flicker of hope refusing to die. "Good boy," I whispered. Hannah's voice broke through. "Ethan, if he makes it through tonight, he has a chance, and that if cut across my ribs like a blade." Outside, the desert wind slammed against the windows as if trying to claw its way in. Inside, Shadow lay suspended on the thin line between life and death, and I knew this was only the beginning of something longer, heavier, and far more important than anything I'd faced since the day Laura left my world. I placed my hand on the steel beside him. "I'm not quitting," I said, "not on you, and I won't let anyone erase you in silence ever again." Shadow survived the night, a fact Hannah called a small miracle in a desert that doesn't give many. And I arrived at the clinic at 5 a.m. just as the first light of Red Mesa slipped through the frosted windows and turned the room into a pale wash of gold, like the first breath of hope. He lay inside the incubator, his body still so thin I could trace every bone, but his breathing had steadied, and when I stepped closer his eyes opened, slow, weak, yet undeniably recognizing me. "Good morning, buddy," I whispered, and though he barely moved his eyes, said it for him. I'm still here. Something loosened in my chest, then the same tightness I'd carried since the day Laura died, the thing that had kept me from feeling any real peace for years. But when Shadow looked at me, I finally understood something simple and powerful. Survival wasn't just instinct, it was a choice. Hannah walked in with a clipboard, her hair pulled back the way it always was during her morning shifts, and she said, "He waited for you," before offering a quiet smile. I haven't seen him react like that to anyone else. I glanced at Shadow, then at her. A dog abandoned in the desert shouldn't trust anyone. But he trusts me, and she replied, "Maybe he sees something in you." Her words held me still. I wasn't ready to think about that, but deep down I knew the truth. Shadow and I carried the same kind of loss, the kind of loneliness no one else noticed. In the days that followed, I spent nearly every hour at the clinic, wiping him down with warm towels, lifting his head so he could drink small sips of water, and talking to him as if my voice could stitch together whatever had broken inside him out there on Route 47. His responses were slow, but they were there, a slight tilt of his head when I touched him, a twitch of his ears when I said his name, a faint glance toward my hands when I adjusted the IV line. One afternoon, when I set a bowl of softened food beside his bed, Shadow pushed himself forward. Trembling, and for the first time since I'd pulled him from the desert, he pressed his nose into my palm. It was a small gesture, but it felt like something inside my ribs tightened until I could barely breathe. "Good boy, Shadow," I whispered. "You're finding your way back." While Shadow healed, Mark never paused in his investigation, and he visited the clinic daily to speak with Hannah and me. The first piece of information he uncovered silenced the whole room. Shadow had once served a veteran named Walter Briggs. The name hit me hard. I knew Walter. Red Mesa was small enough that everyone knew the old man living alone in the trailer north of town. But Mark didn't share much beyond the file. "I'm not ready to jump to conclusions," he said. "This story isn't simple." I looked at Shadow resting with his head on the blanket I'd brought from home, and though I didn't know what Walter's role in this was, I knew one truth clearly: nothing justified leaving a service canine to die alone in the desert. One evening, as I sat reading beside Shadow's bed, the warm lamplight washed over the patches of fur beginning to grow back, casting patterns that reminded me of the way sunset sliced across the empty house I went home to every night. Shadow opened his eyes, blinked once, then inched closer until his head rested against my boot. It wasn't dependence, it wasn't pleading. It was acceptance. A dog who'd been abandoned didn't give that easily. I leaned down, placed my hand over his chest, and felt the heartbeat that had grown stronger day by day. "You're not alone anymore, Shadow. Not ever again." And in that moment, when the darkness outside merged with the warmth of his breath, I understood something I had never dared say aloud. Shadow didn't only need me. I needed him too. 2 lives the desert had tried to leave behind now, finding their way home together. Shadow recovered slowly, as if crawling inch by inch out of his own darkness. Yet every resurrection carried a shadow of its own, and that shadow arrived on the 3rd afternoon when Mark pushed open the clinic door, wearing a look I had never seen on him before. "Ethan, we need to talk," he said quietly, and though my hand had been resting on Shadow's head, it froze at the edge of his voice. "What happened?" I asked, and Mark took a breath that already told me this wasn't news meant to be delivered inside 4 walls. "We found Shadow's full record," he said. "And we found his owner." The air thickened instantly. Hannah stopped writing, and Shadow lifted his head as if he understood far more than any of us gave him credit for. Mark exhaled. "His owner is Walter Briggs." The name hit me like a cold blade. I knew Walter. Everyone in Red Mesa did. A lonely veteran in a decaying trailer at the northern edge of town, spoken about with a mix of pity and resignation. "He's alive?" I asked, And Mark nodded. Yes, but barely. And I think he's coming here. That afternoon, sunlight glazed the clinic windows in a wash of gold when the door opened again and an old man stepped through, stooped, wrapped in a faded military jacket, followed by Linda, his daughter, and Kaylee, his 12-year-old granddaughter, with worry etched across her face. Walter Briggs saw Shadow first, and in that moment when his tired eyes fell on the dog lying on the bed, a heavy silence swallowed the room whole. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice trembling like wind slipping through rotten wood. Shadow flinched his ears, lifting his body, tensing as though trying to recall something torn from memory, and then he released a low cry, half fear, half recognition. Instinctively, I stepped between them. "Do you know what happened to him, Walter?" Walter didn't answer at once. He braced himself against the table, breath shuddering as if fighting something inside. Linda stepped forward. "My dad didn't abandon him out of cruelty. Please, let him explain." Anger sparked at the back of my throat. Shadow nearly died out there. His neck was torn open by a rope. What explanation is good enough for that? Walter closed his eyes and 2 tears slid down, slow, unwilling tears that didn't fall easily. They were the tears of someone who had already lost everything. I have cancer," he said. "Terminal. The doctors say I don't have much time." The room fell silent. "I didn't want Shadow starving in that trailer when I'm gone," he whispered, voice breaking. "He saved me from myself. But I'm not strong enough anymore, not wealthy enough, not anything enough to take care of him." It cut through me like a split beam collapsing, not because of the information, but because of the despair lacing every syllable. I knew that sound. I had heard it in myself the day Laura died. Walter looked at me with a hollow shame. I took him out to the road hoping someone better than me would find him. I didn't think he'd suffer like that. I looked at Shadow, trembling softly yet calmer than before. His eyes no longer fearful but softened with something that looked painfully close to forgiveness. Kaylee stepped closer, resting her small hand on his head. "Grandpa isn't mean," she whispered. "He was just scared, and I understood. The fear of losing the last thing you love. The fear of failing something that saved you. The fear of becoming a burden." I looked from Walter to Shadow, and suddenly all the ugly fragments of this story aligned. And then the healing began, not planned, not guided, but inevitable, the kind of ritual that grows out of shared pain. Walter approached the bed and pulled from his pocket the old rope, the one that had been carved into Shadow's neck, and placed it on the table with shaking hands. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, "but I want to end this the right way." I handed him the new blue collar Hannah had prepared for when Shadow fully recovered. Walter held it, his hands trembling so hard that Kaylee placed hers over his. "Do it, Grandpa," she whispered. Walter bent down and slowly removed the service K9 tag from the old rope, then attached it to the new collar. Shadow watched him without pulling away, and in that moment the silence of Red Mesa seemed to lift just slightly. "Thank you for staying with me, as long as you could," Walter murmured. I placed my hand on Shadow's back. "He won't have to fight alone anymore," I said. No one disagreed, no one needed to. It was the moment when the darkness inside each of us, large or small, was finally shared, and by being shared, finally became bearable. Walter passed away a month after the day he removed the old rope and handed Shadow back to a life he believed would outlast him, and he left quietly in a small hospice room on the south side of Red Mesa, with one hand wrapped around the new blue collar Kaylee had placed there while his eyes drifted shut, as Linda told him Shadow was still eating, still sleeping, still watching the door every afternoon, as if waiting for him to return. Red Mesa wasn't a place for grand funerals, but on the afternoon we buried Walter, More people showed up than I had ever seen at any service in this town, not because he was well known, but because his story and shadows had touched a wound many here understood, yet never spoke about. Shadow stood beside me that day, his black and tan coat grown in full, and his body stronger than it had been in months, and he stayed silent through the ceremony with his head leaning against my leg, as if he knew what was happening, and as if he were saying goodbye in the way dogs do quietly, faithfully, without asking for anything. After the service, Linda approached, her eyes still red, but her voice steadier. "My father knew you would take care of Shadow," she said. "He told us before he went." I swallowed hard. "I'll take care of him for the rest of his life." Kaylee knelt to hug Shadow, her small hands brushing the service K9 tag as she whispered, "Grandpa didn't abandon you. He was just scared. But you're safe now, Shadow. You have a home now." Shadow licked her hand, gentle as a promise. Life didn't return to what it had been before. If anything, it became something better. Shadow lived with me in the little house on the edge of town, and every morning he lay on the porch watching the sun rise over the red soil of the Sonoran, walking beside me on roads I used to travel alone, sensing the quiet spaces inside me that no human ear could hear, the empty spaces left behind after Laura's death. I once believed I would spend the rest of my life in silence, but Shadow wouldn't let me. On the days when the grief came back sharp and sudden, he rested his head on my knee with that deep, steady gaze that seemed to ask, "I'm here. Do you hear me?" And I did, clearer than any spoken words. One evening, as I walked Shadow along the northern dirt road, Mark pulled up in his truck, stepping out to watch us for a moment, as though memorizing the sight. "Thought you'd want to know this," he said. "The town wants to build a place for abandoned dogs and veterans. Small center. They want to name it Shadow's Haven." I laughed under my breath, but the laugh caught on emotion. "Why that name?" Mark looked at Shadow, then at me. "Because he saved you, saved Briggs, and saved this whole town from its silence." Shadow lifted his head toward us as if understanding every word. "They want you to run it," Mark added. I looked down the sun-soaked road, then at Shadow standing tall, beautiful, strong as a creature risen from ash into something greater than what the world had once tried to break. "I'll do it," I said, for him. On the day Shadow's Haven opened, the town turned out in numbers that surprised even Mark and Hannah cut the ribbon, while Linda and Kaylee cried softly as they looked at the hand-carved wooden sign, "Shadow's Haven, a place for healing, for dogs and for people." Shadow stepped into the grass yard first, circling once before returning to stand beside me, his eyes bright as late-day sunlight. An old veteran whispered behind us, "That dog didn't just survive. He taught all of us how to live again." I looked at Shadow, my chest lighter than it had been in years. "Good boy," I said. "We did it." Shadow responded with a gentle press of his head against my hand. No words, no sound, just the pure language of a creature without speech, yet fluent in the one language the human heart understands best: loyalty, forgiveness, and the miracle of being loved again.